Thanksgiving has always been a messy affair in my family, both in the literal sense, because my mother still believes she can cook a turkey without drying it into oblivion, and in the emotional sense, because no gathering is complete without at least one passive-aggressive argument. But this year, I wasn't expecting the mess to be mine. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today, I want to share another touching story with you. Before we continue, please make sure you are subscribed to the channel. Every day I share interesting life stories with you, so enjoy listening. It started with a harmless joke from my uncle. "You and Alex always looked so much alike as kids," Uncle Rick said, shoving a roll into his mouth as he nudged me with his elbow. "Funny, huh?" I glanced across the table at Alex, my cousin, who was too busy scrolling through his phone to care. It wasn't the first time I'd heard that comment. Friends, family, even strangers had made similar observations over the years. Dark hair, sharp cheekbones, the same dimple when we smiled. But something about Uncle Rick's tone made my stomach tighten. Maybe it was because my dad, seated across from us, suddenly shifted uncomfortably. Maybe it was because my mother, who was still fussing over the gravy, froze for a half-second too long before forcing a tight smile. Or maybe it was because, for the first time in my life, I really looked at Alex, and I realized something unsettling. Alex looked like me, but he didn't look like his own father. The thought lodged itself into my brain like a splinter, small but impossible to ignore. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Families share features. Genetics are weird. But the longer I sat there, the less I could shake the feeling that something didn't add up. And I had no idea just how deep the lie went. That night, after the chaos of dinner had settled and I was alone in my apartment, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I pulled up an old family photo on my phone, one from when Alex and I were kids. The resemblance was uncanny. Too uncanny. Then I did something that would change everything. I asked my mother a seemingly innocent question. "Hey, how old was Alex when he was born?" She was wiping down the kitchen counter when I called. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Why do you ask?" she said lightly. I laughed, trying to sound casual. "I dunno. Just came up today. People always say we look alike, and it made me wonder." She hesitated. "He was born in 1994. A few months after you." Something in her voice was off. I didn't push, but when I hung up, my mind was spinning. A few months apart? I did the mental math. If Alex was born in early 1994, that meant his parents, Uncle Rick and Aunt Linda, would have conceived him around the middle of 1993. But I suddenly remembered something else. My parents had a rough patch in 1993. My dad had even moved out for a while. And there were no photos of my mom and dad together that year. The realization hit me in the chest like a punch. What if the reason Alex and I looked alike wasn't because we were cousins? What if we were brothers? I spent the next few days spiraling. I couldn't let it go. I started looking through old family albums whenever I visited my parents' house, flipping through pages with shaking hands. And then I found it. A single photograph, buried deep in an old album, tucked between Christmas pictures and vacation snapshots. My mom, my Uncle Rick, together at a party. His arm was around her waist. They were laughing, their faces flushed. And my mother? She was pregnant. The date on the back? June 1993. My stomach dropped. That was the year before I was born. I knew I should have left it alone. I should have ignored the gnawing suspicion. But I couldn't. So I did something drastic. I ordered a DNA test. I convinced Alex to take one too, spinning it like a fun experiment. "Dude, let's see if we've got any weird ancestry surprises," I joked. He laughed and went along with it, no idea what I was really doing. The results came in 2 weeks later, and my entire life imploded. Alex wasn't my cousin. He was my half-brother. And the man I had called Dad for 29 years? He wasn't my father at all. I stared at the DNA results, my breath coming in short, uneven bursts. Half-brothers, not cousins. Which meant one thing. Uncle Rick, my uncle, was my biological father. And my dad, the man who raised me, the man I had looked up to my entire life, wasn't. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. I read the results again, hoping I'd made some kind of mistake. That maybe I was misinterpreting the numbers, that this wasn't saying what I thought it was saying. But it was. I had spent 29 years living a lie. I don't know how long I sat there, staring blankly at the screen. My fingers had gone numb. My chest felt hollow, like a part of me had caved in. Eventually, Alex's name popped up on my phone. A text. "Dude, these results are wild." I had no idea we were that closely related, faced with years of joy. I didn't answer. I didn't even know what to say. I spent the next few days in a fog. I went to work. I ate. I slept, barely, but my mind was stuck on the results. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe there was some mistake. Maybe the test was flawed. But deep down, I knew the truth. And I knew I couldn't ignore it. So that Sunday, I drove to my parents' house. My mother was in the kitchen when I walked in, washing dishes like it was just any other afternoon. "Hey, sweetheart," she greeted me with a smile. "You should have told me you were coming. I'd have made something." I cut her off. "Mom." My voice was hoarse, like I hadn't spoken in days. "I need to ask you something." She turned, and immediately, I saw it. The way her smile faltered. The slight hesitation in her posture. She knew. My heart pounded. I pulled out the printed DNA results from my pocket and set them on the counter. Her eyes flicked down. And then, just like that, the color drained from her face. The room was so quiet I could hear the clock ticking. "You want to tell me what the hell this means?" I asked. My voice was shaking, but I didn't care. She swallowed hard. "Where did you get that?" "That's what you have to say?" I snapped. "Not an explanation? Not an I'm sorry? Just, where did you get that?" My mother's lips parted like she wanted to say something, but then, before she could, my father walked into the room. He took one look at us, her pale face, my shaking hands, and his expression hardened. "What's going on?" I turned to him, my chest tightening. "Dad," I started, but the word felt foreign on my tongue now. "Did you know?" His jaw clenched. And that's when I knew. I hadn't wanted to believe it. Not really. But the way he wouldn't look at me, the way his shoulders tensed like he was bracing for impact, I knew. "You knew," I whispered. "You've always known." Still, he didn't say anything. Something inside me cracked. "Oh my God," I let out a short, humorless laugh. "I thought I was coming here to get some kind of confession, but you're not even surprised, are you?" Silence. My mother's lips trembled. "I never meant for you to find out this way." "Then what way?" I demanded. "What way were you planning on telling me, Mom? Were you ever planning on telling me?" Tears welled up in her eyes. Who else knew?" I interrupted, my voice rising. "Just you?" "Him." I jerked my chin toward my father. No, not my father. I didn't even know what to call him anymore. My mother sniffled, wiping at her face. "Rick knows." A new wave of nausea rolled over me. Of course he did. My father, the man who raised me, still hadn't said a single word. I turned to him, suddenly furious. "You stayed with her," I said, my voice shaking. "Even after knowing I wasn't yours?" He exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. "You were mine," he finally said, his voice tight. "You were always mine." It should have been comforting. Maybe a part of me even wanted to believe it. But I couldn't. Not anymore. I left without another word. I don't even remember driving home. It felt like I was outside of my own body, watching someone else's life fall apart. Alex called me later that night. I ignored it. My mother texted, "Please, let's talk." I ignored that too. The only one who didn't reach out? My father. Not once. It's been a week since that night. I still don't know what to do. Because no matter how much I want to forget, no matter how much I want to pretend that nothing has changed, everything has. And there's no going back. I spent the next week in a haze. I didn't respond to my mother's texts. I ignored Alex's calls. My dad, the man I thought was my dad, didn't reach out at all. I should have been working, sleeping, living my life. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that DNA test. I saw my mother's face when I confronted her. The way she didn't deny it. The way my father, the man who raised me, hadn't fought for me. And worst of all, I couldn't stop thinking about Uncle Rick. Because if anyone owed me an explanation, it was him. I didn't plan to meet with Rick. In fact, I was determined to never speak to him again. But that decision was ripped away from me when he showed up at my apartment one night. I almost didn't open the door when I saw him through the peephole. But something in me, maybe the part that needed to hear him say it out loud, twisted my hand on the doorknob. He looked guilty. Not just in a "I made a mistake" way, but in a "this has been eating me alive for years" way. His eyes were tired, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets like he was trying to make himself smaller. "Hey, kid," he said quietly. "Don't call me that," I snapped. A flicker of pain crossed his face. "Can I come in?" I thought about slamming the door in his face. I should have. But instead, I stepped aside, arms crossed, as he hesitantly walked in. He looked around like he was seeing me, really seeing me for the first time. Then he let out a shaky breath. "I guess you know." I folded my arms tighter. "You gonna tell me the truth, or are you gonna lie like everyone else?" He flinched but nodded. "The truth." You deserve that. I clenched my jaw, my chest tight. Start talking. The affair that broke everything. Rick sat down on my couch, rubbing his palms against his jeans like he was trying to steady himself. It was never supposed to happen, he started. Your mom and I, we were young. Stupid. I scoffed. Spare me the excuses. He exhaled sharply. You think I don't hate myself for this? For what we did to you? To your dad? He's not my dad, I snapped, hating how raw my voice sounded. Rick's face twisted with something I couldn't place. Pity? Regret? Pain? He is, he insisted. Maybe not by blood, but he raised you. He loved you. He still does. I shook my head, looking away. I didn't want to hear that. Rick ran a hand through his graying hair. Look, your mom and I, we were a mistake. A mistake that never should have happened. But she loved your father. She chose him. And when she found out she was pregnant, she told me it wasn't my place to be involved. Wasn't your place? I repeated, laughing bitterly. You mean, you just got to walk away? Rick's jaw tensed. I wanted to tell you. I did. But your mother, she was scared. She begged me not to say anything. And your dad, he hesitated. He knew. Maybe not at first, but eventually, yeah, he knew. And he still chose to be your father. I swallowed hard. I wanted to hate him. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him he had no right to say any of this to me. But the worst part? I didn't even know who I was angry at anymore. For the first time, I let myself ask the question that had been gnawing at me since I found out the truth. Did you ever want to be my dad? Rick's face crumpled like I had just punched him. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, shaking his head. Every damn day, he admitted, voice thick. But I didn't get to make that choice. Your mom made it for me. Your dad did, too. And I let them. I hated how much that hurt. I wanted to believe he was lying, that he didn't care, that he had just dumped me off on another man and walked away. But the pain in his eyes? It was real. I let out a slow, shaky breath. So what now? Rick looked at me carefully. That's up to you. I hated that answer. I wanted him to tell me what to do. I wanted anyone to tell me what to do. But no one could. Because no matter how much I wished it, there was no way to fix this. No way to go back. Rick left that night without pushing me for anything. No promises, no expectations. But as soon as he was gone, I checked my phone. Still no messages from my dad. I should have been relieved. It should have made it easier to let him go. But instead, it made me feel worse. Because for his whole life, he had known the truth. And yet, I was the one who felt abandoned. Rick left that night, and I sat in my apartment, staring at my phone. Still nothing from my father. Not a text. Not a call. Not a single acknowledgement that my entire world had just collapsed. I thought back to that night in my parents' kitchen, when I had confronted them. How he had just walked away, not fighting, not defending himself, not even trying to explain. At first, I told myself he needed time. That maybe he was struggling too. That maybe he didn't know how to talk to me about this. But days turned into a week. A week turned into 2. And the silence? It stayed. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe some leftover sense of loyalty. Maybe just pure desperation for answers. But one night, I finally caved. I texted him. We need to talk. I stared at my phone, waiting. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Then 2. And just when I was about to give up, 3 dots appeared. My heart pounded. Then, finally, a response. Tomorrow. 6 p.m. The diner. That was it. No emotion. No explanation. Just a meeting time. The next evening, I sat in the corner booth of a dingy little diner off the highway. The kind with cracked vinyl seats and a menu that hadn't changed in 30 years. My father, the man who raised me, walked in 5 minutes late. He looked exhausted, like he hadn't been sleeping. He didn't greet me. Didn't even try to smile. He just sat down across from me, folded his hands on the table, and said, "So, that was it." Just so. I swallowed down the lump in my throat. "That's all you have to say?" He exhaled, rubbing his face. "What do you want me to say, kid?" I flinched at kid. It used to be something comforting, something familiar. But now it just felt like a placeholder for a role he didn't know how to play anymore. I placed my hands on the table, steadying myself. "I want to know why you never told me." He stared at me for a long moment. "Because it wouldn't have changed anything." I let out a bitter laugh. "Wouldn't have changed anything? Are you serious?" He shrugged, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes that made me feel sick. Resentment. "You were my son," he said flatly. "No matter what the DNA said. I was the one who raised you, changed your diapers, took you to baseball games. I was the one who stayed. So yeah, I didn't tell you. Because I didn't think it mattered. I clenched my jaw. It mattered to me. He looked away. I didn't want to lose you. Well, congratulations, I said coldly. You lost me anyway. He sighed, like this conversation was exhausting him. Like I was being unreasonable. And suddenly, I realized something. He had lost me. But it wasn't just because of the secret. It was because he wasn't even trying to fix it. I had spent my entire life loving this man, looking up to him, trusting him. And now, sitting across from him in this cheap diner, I saw him for what he was. A man who had given up on me long before I had ever given up on him. I pushed my chair back. You know, I said, standing up, I came here hoping you'd fight for me. My voice shook. Hoping you'd tell me something that made this better. I grabbed my jacket. But you won't, will you? He didn't answer. And that silence? It told me everything I needed to know. I walked out of that diner and didn't look back. My father didn't call after me. He didn't stop me. He just let me go. And for the first time in my life, I realized I had been holding on to something that was never really mine to begin with. I had spent my entire life believing in a relationship that only existed because I had wanted it to exist. But now, I knew the truth. And I didn't think I'd ever see him again. I walked out of that diner and into a world that suddenly felt unfamiliar. For 29 years, I had been somebody's son, somebody's family. And now, I felt like a ghost, drifting between identities, not sure where I belonged anymore. I kept expecting my dad, no, not my dad, not anymore, to reach out, to call, to show up at my door, maybe even fight for me. But he didn't. Days passed, then a week, then two, and I realized something terrible. I had lost him, not because I walked away, but because he let me. It was my mother who finally broke the silence. I had been ignoring her texts for weeks, deleting them without reading. But then, one night, my phone rang. I saw her name on the screen. And against my better judgment, I answered. Hi, sweetheart, she said, her voice cautious. Can we please talk? I almost hung up. Almost told her to go to hell. But instead, I let out a bitter laugh. Now you want to talk? She exhaled sharply. I know you're angry. Angry. I repeated. That's an understatement. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then, finally, she said, I never wanted you to find out like this. I clenched my fist. Then how did you want me to find out, Mom? Or were you just planning to never tell me? Silence. That told me everything I needed to know. I let out a humorless chuckle. You weren't you? She sniffled, and I knew she was crying. But I couldn't bring myself to care. I did what I thought was best for you, she whispered. No, I shot back. You did what was best for you. She let out a shaky breath. I was scared. I was young. I cut her off. Don't. Because I didn't want excuses. I wanted the truth. You had an affair with Rick, I said flatly. Say it. I could hear her breath hitch. I waited. And then, finally, she whispered, yes. A bitter taste filled my mouth. And you lied to me for my entire life. She let out a quiet sob. I never meant to hurt you. But you did, I snapped. And now I don't even know who I am. She started to say something else, but I couldn't listen anymore. So I did the only thing I could. I hung up. And for the first time, I realized that some wounds don't heal with time. Some wounds only grow deeper. I didn't hear from my mother again after that. Not for weeks. And honestly, I wasn't sure if I ever wanted to. But then, one evening, there was a knock at my door. I opened it. Rick stood there, looking older than I'd ever seen him. Can we talk? He asked. I almost slammed the door in his face. But then I saw something in his eyes. Regret. Not the kind that disappears after a while, but the kind that stays. The kind that eats at you. I stepped aside. He walked in, running a hand through his graying hair. I don't know what to say, he admitted. I folded my arms. Try starting with the truth. He nodded slowly. Then, finally, he said, I wanted to be in your life. I scoffed. Oh yeah? Funny, because I don't remember you ever acting like it. He looked down, his jaw tightening. Your mom didn't want me to be. Bullshit, I snapped. You're a grown man. You could have fought for me. He let out a slow breath. I know. Silence stretched between us. Then, finally, he looked up at me. I can't change the past, but I want to be here now. If you'll let me. I hated how much I wanted to believe him, how much I needed to. But trust? That doesn't come easy. Rick left that night without any promises. Just an offer. A chance. And for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I realized something. I can spend the rest of my life running from this truth. Or I could face it. But the real question? Did I even want to? I spent weeks avoiding the one person I knew I couldn't avoid forever. Alex. I had ignored every one of his calls, every text, every attempt to reach out. And I knew it wasn't fair. He hadn't lied to me. He hadn't done anything wrong. But looking at him was like looking in a mirror I never asked for. A reminder that my entire life had been built on a lie. Still, I knew I couldn't hide from him forever. So, one evening, I finally caved. Me, are you home? Alex, holy shit, you're alive. Yeah, come over. Alex lived in a small apartment not far from mine. When I knocked on his door, he swung it open immediately, staring at me like I was some kind of ghost. Dude, he said, you've been ignoring me for weeks. I know. I rubbed the back of my neck. Sorry. He stepped aside, letting me in. The place was a mess, empty beer bottles on the coffee table, half-eaten takeout cartons stacked on the counter. It was like he'd been going through this just as much as I had. So, he said, sitting on the couch, we're brothers. I let out a breath. Yeah. Silence stretched between us. Then, finally, he laughed. A short, dry, disbelieving laugh. You know, I always thought we looked alike. But I never. He shook his head. This is insane. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Alex studied me for a moment. Are you okay? I almost said yes. Almost lied. But I was so fucking tired of lying. No, I admitted. I'm not. He nodded like he understood. And maybe he did. You talked to Rick? He asked after a while. I hesitated. Yeah. And I exhaled. I don't know, man. He says he wants to be in my life. But I don't know if I can let him. Alex was quiet for a moment. Then he said, you know, he's always been a good dad to me. I tensed. Yeah, well, must be nice. Alex flinched at that, and I immediately regretted saying it. I didn't mean it like that, I muttered. No, you did, he said. And I get it. More silence. Then he asked the one question I wasn't ready for. What about Mom? My jaw clenched. What about her? Alex hesitated. Are you ever going to forgive her? I let out a humorless laugh. She lied to me for my entire life. So, no, I don't think I am. Alex looked down, picking at the label on his beer bottle. She's been a mess, you know. I scoffed. Good. Alex sighed. She's still our mom. Your mom, I corrected. Not mine. Not anymore. He didn't argue. Maybe because he knew I wasn't ready to hear anything else. We sat in silence for a long time after that. Not talking. Just existing. And for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel completely alone. Because maybe I had lost a father. Maybe I had lost a mother. But I hadn't lost everything. I still had a brother. Even if I had never known he was one. I wasn't planning to see her. I had spent weeks ignoring her calls, deleting her texts without reading them. I told myself I had nothing to say to her. That I didn't care how much she was hurting. But when Alex called and said she wasn't doing well, something in me shifted. I didn't forgive her. I didn't even know if I could. But I needed to face her. So, against my better judgment, I found myself standing in front of my childhood home, staring at the door I had walked through 1,000 times before. Only this time, it didn't feel like home anymore. I knocked, and within seconds, the door opened. My mother stood there, looking smaller than I remembered. She had always been a strong woman, opinionated, sharp, in control. But now, she just looked tired. Her eyes were red and puffy like she had been crying for days. Sweetheart, she whispered, her voice trembling. You came. I clenched my jaw. I'm not here for pleasantries. She swallowed hard and stepped aside. Come in. I hesitated before crossing the threshold. The house smelled the same, like vanilla candles and fresh laundry. But it felt different. Colder. Like it didn't belong to me anymore. I followed her to the kitchen, the place where I had confronted her weeks ago. The place where everything had fallen apart. We sat across from each other, the silence thick between us. Then, finally, she whispered, I'm so sorry. I stared at her, expressionless. Sorry for what, exactly? She blinked rapidly, like she was struggling to hold back tears. For everything. For lying. For keeping the truth from you. I scoffed. You lied to me for 29 years. And you expect me to believe you're sorry now. She flinched. I never wanted to hurt you. Then why did you? I snapped. Her hands trembled as she reached for her mug of tea. Because I was scared. I let out a humorless laugh. Scared of what? Of me finding out? Of me hating you? Tears welled in her eyes. Of losing you. I clenched my fists. You lost me anyway. She covered her mouth with a shaking hand, stifling a sob. For the first time, I saw guilt in her eyes. Not just sadness. Not just regret. Real, crushing guilt. And it pissed me off. Because she didn't get to play the victim. Not after what she had done. I leaned forward, my voice low. Did you ever love Dad? Her face crumpled. Of course I did. Then why did you cheat on him? She squeezed her eyes shut. I don't know. Bullshit. Her breath hitched. I was young. Confused. I made a mistake. I shook my head. A mistake is forgetting to pick me up from soccer practice. A mistake is burning dinner. What you did? My voice wavered. That wasn't a mistake. That was a choice. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. I watched her cry, but I felt nothing. No sympathy. No anger. Just emptiness. Because no amount of tears could fix this. I have one question, I said after a while. She lifted her head, her eyes desperate. Anything. I swallowed hard. Did Dad ever love me? She gasped like I had slapped her. Oh, sweetheart. Of course he did. I shook my head. Then why did he let me go so easily? Tears spilled down her cheeks. Because he was hurting. Because he didn't know how to face you. I clenched my jaw. He could have tried. She reached for my hand, but I pulled away. Her face crumbled. Please, don't shut me out. I love you. I stood up. She looked up at me, panic flashing across her face. Please, she whispered. I stared at her for a long moment. Then I turned and walked away. And this time, she didn't try to stop me. I don't remember driving home that night. All I remember is the feeling. Like something inside me had finally broken, but not in the way I expected. It wasn't the sharp, shattering kind of pain that had filled me when I first learned the truth. It was quieter. Like standing in the wreckage of a collapsed building, realizing there's nothing left to salvage. And knowing that the only thing left to do is walk away. 2 days later, Rick called me. I almost ignored it. But some part of me, maybe curiosity, maybe something deeper, made me pick up. Hey, he said, his voice careful. I wanted to check in. I didn't respond. He sighed. I know things are a mess right now. And I know I can't undo what's been done. But I meant what I said, kid. If you want me in your life, I'm here. I let his words hang in the air. For so long, I had wanted a father who chose me. A father who fought for me. And now, I had one standing right in front of me. But I wasn't sure if I could let him in. I need time, I finally said. Rick was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'll wait. And for the first time since this whole thing started, I believed him. I never saw my dad again. Not really. He never called. Never texted. Never tried to fix what had broken between us. And maybe that was the final truth I had to accept. He had never truly been mine to begin with. Not in the way I had always thought. And now that the lie was gone, so was he. My mother kept reaching out. At first, I ignored her. Then, finally, after weeks of silence, I sent her a text. Me, I need space. She replied almost instantly. Mom, I understand. I love you. I'll be here when you're ready. But the truth was, I didn't know if I ever would be. Alex and I didn't talk about it much after that night in his apartment. We didn't need to. Instead, we just moved forward. Late night beers. Dumb jokes. Arguments over football. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And after everything, that was enough. It's been 6 months. I still don't have all the answers. Some days, I wonder if I made the right choices. If I should have fought harder to fix things. If I should have let my mother explain. But then I remember, some things can't be fixed. Some things aren't meant to be fixed. And sometimes, the only thing you can do is let go. So that's what I'm doing. And for the first time in my life, I finally feel free. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories. And before you go, check out the video on your screen. It's another heartfelt story you won't want to miss.